October 1943. A Luftwaffe test facility outside Berlin. German engineers fired captured American 50 caliber rounds into their own aircraft, and what they discovered in those brutal seconds of testing would fundamentally change how the Third Reich viewed air combat over Europe. By the time the smoke cleared, even the most arrogant Nazi test pilots had to admit a terrifying truth. Nothing in their arsenal could survive 8 of those guns firing simultaneously. The morning frost still clung to the grass at Rechlin airfield when Hauptmann Klaus Bergmann watched a crew of technicians wheel out what remained of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6. The aircraft looked pristine from a distance, its camouflage paint scheme immaculate, but Bergmann knew better. This wasn't a fighter being prepped for combat. This was a sacrifice being prepared for execution. Bergmann was 34 years old in October 1943, which made him ancient by Luftwaffe fighter pilot standards. Most of the young lions roaring through the skies over the Reich were barely old enough to shave. 19- and 20-year-old boys who'd grown up worshipping the early war aces and thought combat was glorious. Bergmann had flown 247 missions across 3 years of war. He'd fought over Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. He'd watched the Luftwaffe transform from an unstoppable force into something that was slowly bleeding to death at altitude. And he'd been chosen for this assignment precisely because he'd survived long enough to develop something rare among fighter pilots: perspective. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Rechlin facility was the Luftwaffe's primary testing center, a sprawling complex of hangars, workshops, and firing ranges hidden in the forests of Mecklenburg. It was here that captured Allied aircraft were brought, dissected, and analyzed. Every enemy plane that could be salvaged from crash sites across occupied Europe eventually found its way to Rechlin, where German engineers would strip them down to bare components, searching for technological advantages or vulnerabilities. But this morning's test was different. They weren't examining a captured aircraft. They were about to destroy one of their own. The Bf 109 G6 sitting on the tarmac represented the Luftwaffe's frontline fighter, the backbone of German air defense. Nearly 13,000 would be produced by war's end, making it one of the most numerous variants ever built. It was fast, reaching speeds over 620 kilometers per hour. It was well armed, carrying a 30mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and 2 13mm machine guns above the engine. And in the hands of an experienced pilot, it could still hold its own against most Allied fighters in a turning dogfight. But in recent months, something had changed in the skies over Europe. American heavy bombers were arriving in ever-increasing numbers, and their escort fighters were carving through Luftwaffe formations with a casualness that bordered on contempt. German pilots were coming back from missions, those who came back at all, with stories that sounded almost hysterical. Stories about American fighters that could shred a Bf 109 with a single burst. About wings separating from fuselages. About pilots who never even knew they'd been hit before their aircraft disintegrated around them. The High Command had initially dismissed these reports as exaggeration born from combat stress. Pilots always overestimated enemy capabilities when they were losing. But the numbers didn't lie. Luftwaffe losses over the Reich were climbing at an unsustainable rate, and post-combat analysis of wreckage was revealing a disturbing pattern. German fighters were being destroyed with a thoroughness that went beyond normal combat damage. So the Reich Luftfahrt Ministerium, the Reich Aviation Ministry, had ordered a comprehensive test. They needed to understand exactly what was happening to their aircraft at altitude, and they needed data, not anecdotes, which was why Bergmann was standing on a cold October morning watching technicians mount a very specific weapon system onto a fixed test rig. The weapon was a Browning M2, 50 caliber heavy machine gun, recovered from a crashed American P-47 Thunderbolt 3 weeks earlier. The big fighter had gone down near Schweinfurt after a running battle with Bf 109 seconds, its pilot dead, but its weapons mostly intact. Luftwaffe recovery teams had carefully extracted all 8 machine guns from the wreckage and transported them to Rechlin for analysis. 8 guns. That number kept rattling around in Bergman's head. American designers had looked at their new fighter and decided it needed 8 50 caliber machine guns. Not 2. Not 4. The firepower redundancy seemed almost obscene, wasteful in a way that spoke to American industrial capacity. Germany was struggling to produce enough 20mm cannon ammunition for its fighters. The Americans were putting 8 heavy machine guns on a single aircraft and apparently had ammunition to spare. Oberst Friedrich Steinhoff, the facility's senior test director, walked over to where Bergman stood. Steinhoff was Luftwaffe through and through, a career officer who'd been evaluating aircraft since before the war. He carried a clipboard thick with technical specifications and wore an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "The weapon is ready," Steinhoff said without preamble. "We'll be firing from 200 meters, which represents typical deflection shooting range in combat. The gun is loaded with a mixed belt standard ball ammunition, armor-piercing, and incendiary rounds in the same proportion we found in the American aircraft." Bergman nodded. "What's the rate of fire?" "Approximately 800 rounds per minute," Steinhoff replied, "which means in a 2-second burst, this single gun will fire roughly 27 rounds. Multiply that by 8 guns, and you're looking at over 200 rounds hitting the target in 2 seconds. The math was staggering. Bergman had flown combat where ammunition conservation was critical. German pilots were trained to fire in short, precise bursts because their ammunition loads were limited. The Bf 109's hub-mounted 30mm cannon, devastating as it was, only carried 60 rounds. A pilot had to make every shot count. The idea of having 200 rounds per gun, times 8 guns, represented a completely different combat philosophy. American pilots could afford to spray and pray, to hose down an area with fire, and let volume compensate for precision. "Where are we hitting the 109? Bergman asked. Steinhoff consulted his clipboard. "We'll conduct multiple tests. First test, direct fuselage hit, center mass behind the cockpit. That's where fuel tanks and control cables are concentrated. Second test, wing root, where the wing meets the fuselage. Third test, engine cowling, frontal, aspect. We want to understand what happens to our aircraft under different attack geometries." A young technician approached and saluted crisply. "Herr Oberst, the range is clear. We're ready to begin." The group moved to an observation bunker 50 meters off to the side, a reinforced concrete structure with narrow viewing slits. Inside, more technicians manned cameras and measurement equipment. This test was being documented with the same thoroughness that characterized German engineering: multiple camera angles, high-speed photography, and precise measurements of every variable. Through the viewing slit, Bergman could see the Bf 109 positioned in profile, its distinctive angular lines sharp against the grey morning sky. The Browning M2 was mounted on a fixed test stand, aimed directly at the fighter's fuselage section. A junior officer was making final adjustments to the gun's elevation, using a surveyor's scope to ensure perfect alignment. Steinhoff picked up a field telephone, connected to the firing position. "All personnel clear the range. Prepare to fire on my mark." He glanced at Bergman. "You might want to cover your ears, Hauptmann. These American guns are exceptionally loud." Bergman pressed his hands against his ears. Through the slit, he watched the technician at the gun rig step back and raise his hand in acknowledgement. "Fire," Steinhoff said into the phone. The Browning M2 opened up with a sound that was less a roar and more a physical hammering, a rapid-fire percussion that Bergman felt in his chest cavity. Even through the concrete bunker walls, the noise was overwhelming. The gun's muzzle flashed in a steady strobe as it hurled 50 caliber projectiles at nearly 900 meters per second toward the waiting Messerschmitt. The effect on the Bf 109 was immediate and catastrophic. Bergman watched in fascinated horror as the fighter's aluminum skin simply ceased to exist where the rounds impacted. There was no gradual damage, no progressive failure. One moment there was aircraft structure. The next moment there were ragged holes the size of fists appearing faster than the eye could track. The 50 caliber rounds weren't punching through the thin aluminum, they were obliterating it, each impact sending shockwaves through the metal that created tears and fractures well beyond the actual entry point. The burst lasted 2 seconds, 27 rounds from a single gun. When the firing stopped, the Bf-109's fuselage looked like it had been attacked by a giant with a sledgehammer. A section of skin roughly 1 meter wide had been reduced to shredded metal, internal structures visible through the gaping wounds. Control cables were severed, hydraulic lines ruptured, and what would have been the fuel tank area was completely compromised. Steinhoff lowered the phone slowly, his face pale. "Gott I am Himmel," he muttered. Bergman said nothing. He was too busy calculating what he'd just witnessed. That was one gun for 10 seconds. An American P-47 or P-51 had 8 of those guns. If all 8 fired simultaneously in combat, they would put 216 rounds into a target area in just 2 seconds. No aircraft in the Luftwaffe inventory could survive that kind of punishment. It wasn't a matter of armor or robust construction. This was simple physics. When you dumped that much kinetic energy into aluminum airframe, the aluminum lost. "Next test," Steinhoff said, his voice slightly unsteady. "Wing root attachment point." The technicians moved the gun rig, adjusting its angle to target where the Bf-109's wing met the fuselage. This was a critical structural point, where massive loads from wing lift and control surface movements were transferred to the main airframe. German engineers had spent years optimizing this joint, making it as strong as possible while keeping weight minimal. The second burst was shorter, just 1 second, 14 rounds. The wing root didn't just fail, it disintegrated. The 50 caliber rounds, mixing armor-piercing and incendiary types, tore through the attachment points with casual brutality. Bergman watched as the wing visibly sagged, its structural connection to the fuselage severed. In actual combat, at altitude with aerodynamic loads present, that wing would have separated completely. The aircraft would have tumbled out of the sky, its pilot having perhaps 1 or 2 seconds to realize what was happening before G-forces rendered him unconscious. 3 more technicians had joined them in the bunker, drawn by the sounds of destruction. They stood in silence, watching through the viewing slits as their frontline fighter was systematically demolished by a weapon that represented a completely different approach to air combat. The third test targeted the engine cowling. The Bf-109's Daimler-Benz DB605 engine was a masterpiece of German engineering, a liquid-cooled inverted V12 that produced 1,475 horsepower. It was protected by armoured panels around the radiator and oil systems, armour that had proven adequate against rifle-caliber machine gun fire from British Spitfires. It was not adequate against 50 caliber fire. The burst struck the cowling dead center. Armor-piercing rounds punched through the protective plates like they were paper, penetrating into the engine block itself. Incendiary rounds ignited leaked coolant, creating a burst of flame and steam. The engine cowling peeled back under the onslaught, revealing the shattered remains of what had been a 20,000 Reichsmark precision engine. Steinhoff set down the phone and turned to face the assembled observers. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we need to write a report that the High Command is not going to want to read." Over the next 3 days, Bergman participated in a comprehensive series of tests that grew progressively more disturbing. They tested different attack angles. They tested different ranges. They mounted 2 Brownings together to simulate a twin-gun attack. They fired at different aircraft types, a Fokker-Wulf, Ford EO-190, a Bf-110 heavy fighter, even an old Junkers Ju-87 Stuka that had been relegated to training duties. The results were uniformly catastrophic. German aircraft, regardless of type or role, could not withstand concentrated 50 caliber fire. The rounds were simply too powerful, too destructive, and the Americans were employing them in numbers that made evasion nearly impossible. But the most chilling test came on the 4th day, when Steinhoff ordered a simulation of what American pilots called a high deflection shot attacking from an angle while both aircraft were maneuvering. They mounted all 8 recovered Brownings on a curved track that would allow them to fire in sequence, simulating how rounds would impact a target as an attacker's gun sight swept across it. The target was another Bf 109, this one positioned as if it were in a banking turn. The 8 guns fired in a ripple, one after another, in under 2 seconds. The cumulative effect looked less like gunfire damage and more like the aircraft had been hit by an artillery shell. The fuselage was essentially cut in half, the tail section held on by a few stringers that were visibly twisted and stressed. Both wings showed catastrophic damage. The engine had 3 separate penetrations. The cockpit area where a pilot would have been sitting was shredded. Bergman walked out to inspect the wreckage up close after the firing stopped. He ran his hand along the torn aluminum, feeling the jagged edges where metal had been ripped apart rather than cleanly punctured. He thought about the young pilots he'd trained, the kids who thought combat was about individual skill and bravery. This wasn't about skill. This was about industrial capacity and engineering philosophy. The Americans had built an execution machine and called it a fighter. That evening, Bergman sat in Steinhoff's office as the Oberst drafted his preliminary report. The office was Spartan German. Military efficiency didn't waste space on comfort, but it was warm, and there was real coffee, a luxury that was becoming rare even for senior officers. "What do I tell them?" Steinhoff asked, not looking up from his typewriter. "How do I explain to the Reichsmarschall that our fighters are effectively defenseless against American firepower?" Bergman thought about Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe's commander, a man whose grasp of technical reality had never been his strongest attribute. "You tell him the truth," he said finally. "You tell him that the Americans have developed a weapons system that renders our current fighter designs obsolete. You tell him that no amount of pilot skill can compensate for this disparity in destructive power." "He'll have me shot for defeatism," Steinhoff muttered. "He'll have you shot if German pilots keep dying at the current rate, and you didn't warn him why," Bergman countered. "The numbers don't lie, Friedrich. We've lost over 600 fighters in the last 2 months. That's not sustainable, and now we know why. Every American fighter that gets on our tail has the firepower equivalent of a light anti-aircraft battery. We're sending pilots up in aircraft that can't survive even a glancing blow." Steinhoff stopped typing and looked at Bergman directly. "So what's the solution? We can't produce 8-gun fighters overnight. We don't have the industry, the resources, or the time. What do we tell the pilots who have to fly tomorrow's missions?" It was a fair question, and Bergman didn't have a good answer. The strategic situation was clear enough. Germany was being outproduced, outgunned, and increasingly outflown. The Americans were building fighters in numbers that seemed almost fictional, and every single one of those fighters carried enough firepower to destroy multiple German aircraft if flown competently. "We tell them to avoid engagement unless conditions are perfect," Bergman said slowly. "We tell them that survival is more important than victory. We tell them that the Americans have changed the rules of air combat, and we haven't adapted yet." Steinhoff smiled grimly. "You know what the High Command will say to that. They'll say we're cowards. They'll say German pilots don't retreat. They'll give us speeches about willpower and determination." "Then German pilots will keep dying," Bergman said flatly. 8 guns, Friedrich. Think about what that means tactically. It means American pilots don't need to be marksmen. They can fire from longer range because they have the ammunition to spare. They can correct their aim during the burst because they're putting out so much volume. They can engage multiple targets in a single pass because they're not conserving ammunition. We've built an entire tactical doctrine around precision gunnery and ammunition conservation, and the Americans have made both concepts irrelevant through sheer firepower. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The report that Steinhoff submitted to the Reichsluftfahrtministerium in late October 1943 was 17 pages of technical analysis, ballistic data, and high-speed photography that documented the systematic destruction of Luftwaffe aircraft under controlled conditions. It included precise measurements of penetration depth, structural failure patterns, and calculated probabilities of catastrophic damage based on hit location and burst duration. But the report's most damning section wasn't the technical data. It was the 3-paragraph conclusion that Steinhoff had agonized over for 2 days before finally typing. The American 50 caliber M2 Browning machine gun represents a qualitative leap in air-to-air armament that fundamentally alters the tactical environment over Europe. When employed in batteries of 6 to 8 guns, as currently configured on P-47 and P-51 aircraft, this weapon system can destroy any Luftwaffe fighter with a burst of less than 2 seconds duration. Current German fighter design philosophy, which prioritizes maneuverability and cannon armament over structural resilience, leaves our aircraft critically vulnerable to this type of attack. Immediate revision of tactical doctrine and long-term redesign of fighter specifications are recommended as matters of operational urgency. The report disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of the Reich for 3 weeks. During that time, Bergmann returned to his unit, Jagdgeschwader 27, based at Wiesbaden-Erbenheim. The airfield sat in the path of American bomber streams heading deeper into Germany, which meant the Geschwader flew multiple sorties daily, intercepting formations of B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds that seemed to grow larger with each passing week. And increasingly, those bombers were escorted by fighters carrying 8 50 caliber machine guns. Bergmann noticed the change in his pilots immediately. These weren't the cocky youngsters of 1941 who'd thought air combat was romantic adventure. These were exhausted men who flinched at engine sounds and calculated survival odds before every mission. They'd stopped talking about kills and victories. Now they talked about making it through the day. The ready room had become a somber place. Where once pilots had joked and boasted between missions, now they sat in silence, smoking cigarettes down to the filter and staring at nothing. The wall that had once displayed photos of squadron victories and social gatherings now showed mostly empty spaces where fallen pilots' pictures had been removed. The tradition was to leave the photos up for 1 week after a pilot was killed or went missing, then take them down quietly. By November 1943, they were removing photos almost daily. Bergmann watched his young pilots age years in weeks. Lieutenant Steiger had arrived at the unit in September, with bright eyes and an eagerness that reminded Bergmann of himself in 1940. By early November, Steiger's hands shook when he held his coffee cup, and he developed a nervous habit of constantly checking over his shoulder, even on the ground. It was a symptom Bergmann had seen before combat fatigue, the slow erosion of nerves that came from flying missions where survival was increasingly random rather than skill-based. The maintenance crews were struggling too. They'd patch up aircraft that limped back from missions, covering bullet holes with metal patches, replacing shot-out instruments, fixing hydraulic systems that had been perforated by machine gun fire. But there was an underlying futility to the work. They were repairing aircraft that would likely be shot to pieces again within days, sometimes within hours. The chief mechanic, an older Feldwebel named Kraus, who'd been maintaining aircraft since the Spanish Civil War, had stopped bothering to make repairs look neat. "Why waste time on cosmetics?" he'd said to Bergmann one evening. "These planes are already dead. We're just keeping them flying long enough to carry pilots to their graves." It was a dark sentiment, but Bergmann couldn't argue with it. The attrition rate was unsustainable, and everyone knew it. On November 8th, Bergmann led a swarm, a 4-aircraft tactical formation, to intercept a bomber formation heading toward Frankfurt. The mission brief had promised light escort, which was Luftwaffe intelligence code for "we have no idea what's actually up there." They climbed through broken clouds at 7,000 meters, Bergmann scanning the sky with the constant vigilance that had kept him alive through 250-plus missions. He spotted the bombers first, a box formation of B-17 seconds, maybe 30 aircraft stacked in defensive layers. Their contrails painted white lines across the pale November sky. But what made his stomach clench wasn't the bombers. It was the fighters weaving above and around them. P-51 Mustangs, at least 24 of them, maybe more. The sleek American fighters prowled around the bomber formation like wolves guarding a flock, their silver paint schemes catching the sunlight. Bergman could see their drop tanks still attached, which meant they'd flown all the way from England and still had fuel to burn. The Luftwaffe's strategic advantage of fighting over home territory was evaporating. The Americans could now escort their bombers anywhere over the Reich. Rotkelchen Schwarm. This is Rotkelchen 1, Bergman transmitted, using his unit's tactical call sign. I count 20+ escorts, high and wide. We are not engaging. Repeat, we are not engaging. Break off and return to base. There was a moment of radio silence. Then Lieutenant Steiger, one of his wingmen, responded with barely controlled frustration. Rotkelchen 1, those bombers are heading toward Frankfurt. Our orders are to intercept. Our orders are also to survive, Bergman replied calmly. Those P-51 seconds are looking for a fight. If we attack the bombers, they'll bounce us with altitude and speed advantage. 4 aircraft against 20+ is not combat, it's suicide. Return to base. He banked away from the bomber stream, and after a tense few seconds, his 3 wingmen followed. Behind them, the B-17 seconds droned on toward their target, unmolested. Bergman knew he'd face questions about his decision, possibly even a formal inquiry. German fighter doctrine emphasized aggression, attacking regardless of odds. Turning away from enemy bombers went against every principle the Luftwaffe had drilled into its pilots. But Bergman had seen the test results at Rechlin. He knew exactly what 8 50-caliber guns could do to a Bf-109, and he wasn't going to lead his pilots into a slaughter just to satisfy tactical doctrine written before the Americans had arrived in force. The inquiry came 2 days later. Bergman stood in the Geschwader commander's office, while Oberstleutnant Werner Schroer, a veteran with 114 confirmed victories, read through the mission report with an expression that cycled between disbelief and anger. You turned away, Schroer said finally. You had visual contact with enemy bombers, and you turned away. I had visual contact with a heavily escorted bomber formation, Bergman corrected. 4 fighters against 25 escorts is not a combat engagement, Herr Oberstleutnant. It's a massacre waiting to happen. Since when do Luftwaffe pilots calculate odds before attacking? We have orders to intercept American bombers. Those orders don't come with conditions about favorable numbers. Those orders were written when we had air superiority, Bergman said evenly. The situation has changed. The Americans are arriving with escort fighters that carry firepower we cannot match and can now reach any target in Germany. Our tactical doctrine hasn't adapted to this reality. Reality? Schroer's voice rose. I'll tell you reality, Hauptmann. Reality is that American bombers hit Frankfurt 2 days ago and killed 700 civilians because fighters like yours didn't engage. Reality is that the High Command is demanding results, and pilots who refuse combat are not delivering results. Bergman remained silent. There was no point arguing with Schroer, who was a brilliant tactical pilot but had never been to Rechlin, had never seen what 50-caliber rounds did to German fighters. He hadn't watched a Bf-109 get torn apart in 2 seconds. He still thought this was about courage and skill. I'm assigning you to bomber intercept duty tomorrow, Schroer continued. Direct orders from me. You will engage any bomber formation you encounter, regardless of escort strength. If you refuse combat again, I'll have you transferred to a training unit. Are we clear? Perfectly clear, Herr Oberstleutnant, Bergman replied. He walked out of the office, knowing that tomorrow's mission might be his last. The mathematics of air combat had changed fundamentally, but the Luftwaffe's command structure hadn't acknowledged it yet. Pilots were still being sent against overwhelming odds, because admitting the truth that German fighters were outgunned and increasingly irrelevant would mean acknowledging that the war was lost. That night, Bergman sat in the pilot's ready room with his flight, 4 aircraft scheduled for dawn intercept duty. The other 3 pilots were young, none over 23, all with less than 50 missions. Good kids, capable pilots, but they didn't have the experience to understand what they were facing. "I need to tell you something," Bergman began, and laid out everything he'd learned at Rechlin. He described the tests in detail, the systematic destruction of German fighters, the catastrophic damage from short bursts, the complete inability of Luftwaffe aircraft to withstand concentrated, 50 caliber fire. "American fighters carry 8 of these guns," he said. "That means if they get a clean shot, even for 1 second, you're dead. The aircraft won't survive, armor won't help, evasive maneuvers won't help unless you break contact before they fire. Your only chance is to never let them get behind you." Lieutenant Steiger looked skeptical. "With respect, Herr Hauptmann, we've all been hit by machine gun fire before. Aircraft can take damage." "Not this damage," Bergman said flatly. "I watched them fire at a 109 for 2 seconds. The fuselage was essentially cut in half. This isn't rifle-caliber fire from Spitfires. This is something completely different. The Americans have industrialized killing us, and we're still fighting like it's 1940. He could see the doubt in their faces. These pilots had been raised on stories of Luftwaffe invincibility, of German technical superiority, of individual combat skill deciding battles. Accepting that they were flying obsolete aircraft against a numerically and technologically superior enemy was difficult, especially when they'd been ordered to attack regardless of odds. "Tomorrow's mission," Bergman continued, "we'll engage if we can isolate bombers without fighter escort. If escorts are present, we stay defensive. We probe for openings, but we don't commit to attacks that put us in disadvantageous positions. Survival is the priority. You can't defend Germany if you're dead." They flew at dawn, climbing through morning mist toward the predicted intercept point. Intelligence had tracked a bomber formation assembling over the English Channel, heading toward targets in the Ruhr industrial region. The bombers would cross into German airspace within 30 minutes. Bergman's 4-ship formation reached 8,000 meters and leveled off, throttles pulled back to conserve fuel. The November sun was just cresting the horizon, painting the cloud deck below them in shades of orange and gold. Beautiful morning, perfect killing weather. The bombers appeared as expected, another massive box formation. B-24 Liberators this time, their distinctive twin tails, unmistakable even at distance. Bergman counted quickly, 36 aircraft, maybe 40, and surrounding them like angry hornets, at least 30 escort fighters. P-47 Thunderbolts. The big, brutish American fighters that were essentially flying tanks armed with 8 50 caliber guns. "Rotkelchen Schwarm, stay together," Bergman transmitted. "We'll maintain altitude and parallel their course. Look for stragglers or damaged aircraft separating from formation." They paced the bomber stream for 10 minutes, staying just out of range. The P-47 seconds noticed them. Bergman could see a pair of escorts climbing to investigate, but the American fighters maintained their protective cordon around the bombers. Smart tactics. The escorts weren't being drawn away by potential targets. They were staying with their primary mission. Then, Bergman spotted what he'd been hoping for. A B-24 trailing smoke from its number 3 engine, dropping back from the main formation. The straggler was still above 7,000 meters, but losing altitude slowly, its crew probably debating whether to continue or turn back for England. "Rotkelchen Schwarm, damaged bomber, 4 o'clock low," Bergman called. "We'll make one pass, hit the remaining engines, then break away before escorts respond. Stay tight on my wing." He rolled into a diving attack, building speed as gravity pulled his Bf 109 toward the wounded Liberator. The bomber's gunners saw them coming. Tracer fire reached out from the tail and waist positions, but Bergman was approaching from an angle that minimized his exposure to defensive fire. At 400 meters, he opened fire. His 30mm cannon hammered out 5 rounds before jamming typical reliability problems with the Mk-108. But his 13mm machine guns kept firing, stitching holes across the B-24's wing route. He saw pieces of aluminum skin peel away, saw coolant streaming from the No. 4 engine. The bomber heeled over into a steeper dive, clearly in serious trouble now. Bergman's wingmen followed him through, adding their fire to the attack. The B-24 was burning now, trailing thick black smoke. He could see crew members bailing out, parachutes blooming white against the clouds below. "Brake! Brake left!" someone screamed over the radio. Bergman snapped his head around and felt his blood turn to ice. 4 P-47 seconds were diving on them from altitude, their attack angles perfect, speed advantage overwhelming. The escorts had been waiting for exactly this German fighters committing to an attack and becoming vulnerable. "Split and dive," Bergman ordered, slamming his stick forward and left. His Bf 109 dropped like a stone, the altimeter unwinding so fast the needle was a blur. Behind him, he could hear the ripping canvas sound of 50 caliber fire as the P-47 seconds opened up. Lieutenant Steiger's aircraft came apart. That was the only way to describe it. Bergman caught a glimpse in his mirror of the Bf 109, simply disintegrating under concentrated fire from 2 P-47 seconds. The tail section, separated first, then the wings folded upward and back like they were made of paper. The entire sequence took perhaps 1 second. Steiger didn't even have time to scream. Bergman pulled out of his dive at 4,000 meters, his airspeed pushing 700 kilometers per hour, the Bf 109's airframe groaning under the stress. He looked around frantically for his other 2 wingmen. One, Feldwebel Koch, was with him, aircraft intact but trailing vapor from what might be a damaged coolant line. The 4th aircraft was gone. Just gone. Either shot down or scattered so far that visual contact was impossible. The P-47 seconds didn't pursue below 5,000 meters. They climbed back to altitude, returning to their escort duties. They'd gotten what they came for, killed at least 1 German fighter, maybe 2, damaged a 3rd, and they'd done it with casual efficiency that was more frightening than aggressive combat. Bergman and Koch made it back to Wiesbaden-Erbenheim with minimal fuel remaining. As Bergman climbed out of his cockpit, ground crew were already examining the bullet holes in Koch's aircraft. There were at least 15 strikes across the fuselage and wings, none of them critical hits, but the pattern was unmistakable. The P-47 pilot had been firing from maximum range, probing shots rather than a committed kill attempt. "Steiger's gone," Bergman told the crew chief. "He didn't get out, and Hartmann is missing." The crew chief nodded grimly. It was the same story every day now. Pilots going out and not coming back, aircraft being shot to pieces. The Luftwaffe was bleeding to death in the skies over Germany, and everyone on the airfield could see it happening. That evening, Oberstleutnant Schroer summoned Bergman again, but this time the tone was different. Schroer looked exhausted, older somehow, the bravado from 2 days ago replaced by something closer to resignation. "The RLM sent a directive today," Schroer said quietly, sliding a document across his desk. "New, tactical guidelines for engaging escorted bomber formations. It's based on a report from the Rechlin test facility about American 50 caliber armament." Bergman picked up the directive and read through it. The language was bureaucratic, carefully worded to avoid admitting failure, but the substance was clear. German fighters were to avoid prolonged engagement with American escorts unless absolutely necessary. Priority was to be given to attacking unescorted bombers or isolated stragglers. Pilots were authorized to break off attacks if faced with superior numbers or unfavorable tactical situations. In other words, everything Bergman had been saying for weeks. The High Command had finally acknowledged reality. "We lost 18 pilots yesterday," Schroer continued, "across all units in this sector. 18 pilots in 1 day. At that rate, we'll have no operational fighters by Christmas. The Americans are destroying us, Klaus. Not because their pilots are better, most of them are. Barely trained, but because their equipment is overwhelming. Those 8 guns." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I know," Bergman said simply. "Your decision 2 days ago," Schroer said. refusing to engage the bomber stream. "I'm told that was the right call. The Americans would have slaughtered your entire flight. Steiger, today. That's proof enough." Bergman set down the directive. "What happens now?" "Now we try to survive," Schroer replied. "The war isn't ending soon. Hitler still believes in wonder weapons and strategic miracles. So we'll keep flying, keep fighting, but with tactics that acknowledge we're no longer the hunters. We're the hunted." The psychological shift in the Luftwaffe was palpable over the following weeks. Pilots who had once scrambled eagerly to intercept enemy formations now showed visible reluctance during pre-mission briefings. The swagger and bravado that had characterized German fighter pilots in the early war years had evaporated, replaced by a pregnant, grim professionalism focused entirely on survival. Men checked and rechecked their equipment with obsessive attention to detail, knowing that a jammed gun or failed radio might mean the difference between living and dying. Bergman noticed that experienced pilots were developing new superstitions. Feldwebel Koch refused to fly without a specific scarf his wife had knitted. Another pilot, Oberfeldwebel Mannheim, would only fly aircraft with even-numbered tail codes. These rituals were irrational, but they gave men something to control in a situation where almost everything was beyond their control. When you knew that survival depended more on luck than skill, you grabbed onto whatever psychological anchors you could find. The new tactical directives slowly filtered through Luftwaffe fighter units. Pilots who had been trained for aggressive attack were now being told to be cautious, selective, to preserve themselves and their aircraft. It went against every instinct, every piece of doctrine they'd absorbed, but the casualty rates made the necessity undeniable. Bergman flew another 43 missions before the war ended in May 1945. He never achieved ace status. The Luftwaffe required 5 victories, but he brought his pilots home alive more often than not, which in late-war Germany was its own form of success. He watched the Luftwaffe collapse from lack of fuel, lack of pilots, lack of hope. He watched American fighter formations grow larger and more confident until they owned the sky completely. And through it all, he remembered those tests at Rechlin, the sound of 50 caliber rounds ripping through aluminum, the casual brutality of 8 guns firing in unison, the realization that German engineering, for all its precision and sophistication, had been outthought by American pragmatism. When in doubt, add more guns. After the war, Bergman spent 3 years in a British POW camp before returning to what was left of Germany. He never flew again, couldn't afford to, didn't want to, but he occasionally gave talks at aviation museums describing the air war from a German perspective. Audiences always wanted to hear about dogfights and heroics. Bergman usually talked about the tests at Rechlin instead. "We tested captured American ammunition," he would say, "and learned that we'd brought swords to a gunfight. The Americans didn't beat us with better tactics or braver pilots. They beat us with 8 50 caliber machine guns that could destroy any aircraft in 2 seconds. Everything else was just details." The Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun remained in service with American forces long after the war ended. It was used in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The basic design, created in 1918 and refined through the 1,930 seconds, proved so effective that it remains standard equipment on American aircraft, vehicles, and ships more than a century later. It's possibly the most successful weapon system ever designed, simple, reliable, devastatingly effective. For Luftwaffe pilots in 1943 and 1944, it was the sound of the war ending. That distinctive hammering roar of 8 Brownings firing at once meant your aircraft was about to come apart, your mission was over, and your survival depended on luck rather than skill. German test pilots at Rechlin had proven it scientifically. The combat pilots over Germany proved it every day at altitude. Nothing could survive 8 guns. The Germans had tested it thoroughly, documented it carefully, and admitted the truth in confidential reports that worked their way through the bureaucracy until policy changed. But by then, thousands of pilots had already learned the lesson the hard way, usually in the last seconds before their aircraft disintegrated around them. Klaus Bergmann died in 1987 at age 78, having lived long enough to see German and American pilots training together in NATO exercises. The young pilots flew jets capable of speeds and altitudes that would have seemed like science fiction in 1943. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged. In air combat, overwhelming firepower still trumped everything else. The last public interview Bergmann gave, recorded by a German aviation historian in 1985, included this exchange. "Do you think the Luftwaffe could have won if we'd had better aircraft?" Bergmann was quiet for a long moment. "We had good aircraft, excellent pilots, superior tactics for a while, but the Americans understood something we didn't, that air combat is ultimately about throwing enough metal at the enemy that skill becomes irrelevant." 8. 50 caliber machine guns meant an average pilot could kill our best aces. That's not a gap you close with better training or braver men. That's industrial warfare, and America was built for it. Any regrets? Only that it took us so long to admit what the tests proved. We knew by October 1943 that our fighters couldn't survive against American firepower. We kept sending pilots up anyway. That's the regret all those young men who died after we already knew the truth. The tests at Rechlin had proven it beyond doubt. The Americans hadn't just built better fighters. They'd built execution machines that turned air combat from a contest of skill into a matter of mathematics. 8 guns, firing 200 rounds per second, obliterating whatever they touched. German pilots tested it, documented it, and admitted what nothing could survive. But admitting defeat and stopping the killing were two different things. The war ground on for another 18 months, and the 50 caliber Brownings kept hammering away, day after day, until there was nothing left to destroy. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.